Yo, what's good, everyone? So, something happened this week that has the internet buzzing all over again. And this time, it's not a leaked interview clip or some random Twitter thread. It's official court documents. A massive batch of previously sealed Epstein-related records has just been released to the public. We're talking thousands upon thousands of pages. Depositions, emails, contact lists, flight logs, testimony transcripts. The kind of paperwork that most people would never sit down and read. But once people start digging, it changes the conversation. And Joe Rogan just weighed in on it. Now here's what makes this interesting. Joe didn't come at this from a conspiracy angle. He didn't scream about secret governments. He didn't claim to have hidden information. What he did say, though, is that the scale of connections revealed in official records is what keeps disturbing people. Because when you look at these documents, not headlines, not viral posts, actual filings and testimony, you start to see how many powerful circles intersected with one individual. And that's where the discomfort starts. Let's break down what was actually released. The Department of Justice and federal courts have gradually unsealed materials tied to past lawsuits and criminal proceedings connected to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Some of these documents stem from civil cases filed years ago. Others are related to testimony given under oath. A lot of it is heavily redacted, names blacked out, paragraphs removed, entire sections sealed. But even through the redactions, patterns emerge. Repeated meetings, social events, flights logged, emails exchanged, introductions facilitated. Now, and this is crucial, appearing in a contact list or flight log does not equal criminal wrongdoing. That distinction matters. But what Joe pointed out is something psychological, not legal. When the same names keep appearing across different documents, across different years, across different settings, it makes people uneasy. Because the Epstein case was never just about one man's crimes. It was about how someone with a 2008 conviction for soliciting a minor was still able to maintain relationships with extremely influential individuals afterward. That's the part that Rogan said is hard to wrap your head around. He openly admitted that years ago, when people talked about Epstein's private island and the idea that high-profile individuals visited it, he thought it sounded exaggerated. Not fake necessarily, just exaggerated. Something that felt like internet amplification. But now, we know certain elements were factual. The island existed. The properties existed. Private jets were used. Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted in federal court for sex trafficking. Epstein was arrested in 2019, before his death in custody. Those are established facts. And Rogan's reflection wasn't, this proves some hidden master plan. It was more like, how did so many influential people end up orbiting around someone who had already faced serious charges in the past? That's a fair question. And it's one journalists have been asking for years. Let's talk about some of the names that have resurfaced in public discussion. Again, strictly based on reporting and publicly acknowledged contact. Bill Gates has publicly admitted meeting Epstein multiple times after Epstein's 2008 conviction. Gates has said those meetings were a mistake and that he regrets the association. Melinda French Gates has spoken openly in interviews about how uncomfortable she felt after meeting Epstein once, describing him as deeply disturbing. She has also said Bill's continued association was one of several factors that contributed to the breakdown of their marriage. That's not speculation, that's from interviews she gave directly. Donald Trump has also faced renewed scrutiny due to past social interactions with Epstein in the early 2000s. Trump has repeatedly stated that he cut ties with Epstein long before the 2019 arrest and has denied any wrongdoing. Former President Bill Clinton's name appears in publicly reported flight logs. Clinton has denied ever visiting Epstein's private island and has denied knowledge of any criminal activity. Elon Musk's name has appeared in media reports referencing communications, and Musk has publicly denied visiting Epstein's island or being involved in any misconduct. And here's where Rogan's broader point comes in. The discomfort isn't necessarily about proving guilt, it's about proximity. Because proximity to someone later exposed as a criminal raises questions, even if it doesn't answer them. Joe framed it as a lesson in how power operates socially. When you reach extreme levels of wealth and influence, your social circle doesn't look normal anymore. You don't attend open public events casually. You don't network in typical environments. You operate inside private rooms, invitation-only gatherings, foundation events, exclusive retreats. And history shows that some of the biggest scandals across politics, business, entertainment have emerged from closed environments where scrutiny was minimal. That doesn't automatically imply coordinated wrongdoing, but it does explain why public trust erodes quickly. Rogan also touched on something psychological. He said that when someone appears philanthropic, well-connected, and endorsed by respected figures, people lower their guard. Epstein positioned himself as a financier and philanthropist. He donated to universities. He attended conferences. He moved in elite academic and political circles. That kind of social positioning creates credibility, and credibility creates access. That's not conspiracy thinking. That's social psychology. The bigger institutional question becomes, how did someone with documented legal trouble continue to receive access to powerful spaces? That's not about hidden agencies. That's about gatekeeping and reputation management. And that's what makes this story linger, because it forces uncomfortable conversations about accountability at the highest levels. Another thing Rogan said that stood out was how long it took for mainstream conversation to catch up. Epstein was first charged in 2008. He entered a controversial plea deal. He served limited time under work release conditions. Then he re-entered high-level social circles. For years, that aspect didn't dominate headlines. Only after the 2019 arrest did the scale of attention explode. And now, with additional documents being unsealed, people are revisiting the timeline. Why did it take so long? Who overlooked what? Who continued associations after warning signs? These aren't conspiracy questions, they're institutional ones. There's also the broader issue of how legal documents work. When thousands of pages are released, context matters. A name appearing in an email doesn't equal endorsement. A flight log entry doesn't equal knowledge of wrongdoing. A contact in an address book doesn't equal participation in crimes. But patterns over time create narratives, and narratives shape public opinion. That's what Rogan was dissecting. He wasn't claiming hidden operations were still running. He was pointing out that once trust is broken at that scale, skepticism becomes permanent. And that's where this case differs from typical scandals. Most scandals involve a single individual or small group. The Epstein case exposed a social web that crossed industries: finance, politics, academia, entertainment. Even if the majority of those connections were surface level or social, the optics alone were damaging. And optics matter in public trust. There's also the fact that Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted, which legally confirms that trafficking occurred within that network. That conviction alone means the operation wasn't imaginary. So when additional documents surface, people aren't imagining wrongdoing from scratch. They're responding to established criminal outcomes and asking how wide the awareness extended. Rogan described it as a rabbit hole, not because it leads to some underground layer, but because every answer seems to lead to more complexity. And complexity makes people uneasy, especially when it involves power. Another key point is how media coverage has evolved. Early reporting on Epstein was relatively contained. After 2019, it became global. Now, with document releases happening years later, we're seeing delayed transparency. And delayed transparency fuels suspicion. Even if nothing new proves additional crimes, the perception of withheld information damages confidence. That's the real long-term impact. Trust. Trust in institutions. Trust in elite circles. Trust in accountability systems. And that's what Rogan was really reacting to. Not secret takeovers, not hidden rulers, but the realization that power networks can operate socially in ways the public barely understands. And when those networks intersect with criminal activity, even if only through association, confidence erodes. So where does this leave things? Legally, most of the high-profile individuals mentioned in media reports have denied wrongdoing. No new mass indictments have come from these document releases. But socially, the conversation isn't going anywhere, because the case reshaped how people view elite proximity. It introduced the idea that status can shield reputations for years until it doesn't. And Rogan's takeaway seemed to be less about shock and more about reflection. 10 years ago, he thought parts of the story sounded overblown. Now, with official records public and convictions secured, he acknowledges that the scale was more serious than he initially realized. That's growth and perspective. And that's probably the healthiest way to approach this. Stick to documented facts. Separate association from guilt. Ask institutional questions without inventing hidden villains. Because if there's one lesson from the Epstein case, it's that real-world corruption doesn't need science fiction elements to be disturbing. The confirmed parts are already disturbing enough. But here's something I don't think enough people are talking about. This whole situation is also exposing how the internet processes information now. 10 years ago, if someone said, "There's a billionaire flying powerful people to a private island," most people would have laughed it off. Not because it wasn't possible, but because it sounded too cinematic. Now, we've lived through so many real-world scandals that nothing sounds unrealistic anymore. And that shift is important, because the Epstein case didn't just expose individuals. It exposed how narratives evolve. At first, something gets labeled a rumor. Then it becomes a conspiracy theory. Then documents come out. Then courts get involved. Then convictions happen. Then more documents surface years later. And suddenly, what once sounded exaggerated becomes part of the historical record. That doesn't mean every rumor is true, but it does mean the line between impossible and documented isn't as rigid as people once thought. And I think that's what Joe was really reflecting on. Not fear, not secret masterminds, but the realization that sometimes the truth is stranger than the version we initially allow ourselves to believe. It also forces a more uncomfortable realization. We tend to assume power equals stability, that the most successful people must also be the most vetted, the most scrutinized, the most carefully observed. But the Epstein story shows something different. It shows that influence can create insulation, not guilt, insulation. So as more documents surface over time, the key isn't panic, it's scrutiny, it's careful examination. It's distinguishing between verified evidence and online amplification. And that's something Rogan emphasized, the importance of not jumping to conclusions, even while acknowledging the discomfort. Because once trust collapses, rebuilding it takes decades. Let me know what you think. Do these document releases change your perspective at all? Or is this just another chapter in a story that's been unfolding for years? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Anyway, this concludes today's video. Be sure to subscribe to LoafTube for future celebrity videos, and turn on that post notification bell so you don't miss out on any future uploads. Until then, see you in the next one.